Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Enemy Front for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a first-person shooter by City Interactive Games, or CI Games as they're known now, and was released in June of 2014. It's fairly interesting for a couple of reasons, the first of them being that it focuses very heavily on the Polish resistance during World War II instead of the usual thing that you see with World War II, which is just the main battles. And so it has potential to be something very different, and it is described on its Steam page as, and I quote, "the first truly modern World War II FPS, featuring stunning visuals, open-ended levels, and a richly interactive combat experience that breaks out of the standard model of highly linear scripted FPS experiences, giving the player full freedom to own their playing style." That sounds interesting, right? Well, let's see how it turned out. Let's go ahead and start by talking about the presentation and the whole claim of stunning visuals. No, they're not stunning. I mean, it does run on CryEngine 3, and it looks alright. A lot of it actually looks fairly decent. But there's some things in there that just really take you out of the experience, like the cutscenes, for example. They are very clearly pre-rendered, and they are rather pixelated and at a much lower quality than the actual game. So what you end up having there is some pretty heavy video compression that looks terrible. And when you actually get into the game proper, you find that by and large it looks alright. I mean, there's nothing particularly amazing about the visuals. It's actually really nice that they decided to throw in quite a bit of color in this game instead of just doing the standard brown and gray and realistic crap that we've seen for years and still plaguing the gaming industry to this day. But the modeling's not particularly amazing. I mean, it's alright, it works just fine, and everything's decently detailed, but it's certainly not stunning. The texture work is decent, considering this was primarily made for PS3 and Xbox 360, but on PC it doesn't look all that great, particularly when you get to the really high resolutions, where the textures look especially blurry, but they don't look terrible. The animations are alright. They look decent enough. I mean, they're kind of cheesy in some respects and a bit too clean in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of glitches with the animations, too. It gets really annoying. Sometimes you'll be aiming down your sights, for example, and then all of a sudden, your field of view will change. And it goes from being the normal field of view that you're used to by zooming in, but it suddenly will change back to the wider field of view that you get when you're actually just running around on the ground. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Things like that happen all the time, where there's just these weird glitches that don't really kill the experience, but they just look odd, and you have no idea why they actually happen. Now, I did have to up the FOV, because the thing starts out at a really low FOV of something like 55, I think. And I had to bring that up because that makes me nauseous. So, luckily they have the ability to do that in an INI file, but you can at least do it. On console, though, you're stuck with the low FOV, so keep that in mind. So the visuals are a bit rocky, but what about the rest of the presentation, the sound design, for example? Well, it's very hit or miss. For the most part, the voice acting is okay. There's nothing particularly noteworthy about it. I mean, it's just fairly average voice acting, but at least they didn't do anything particularly bad with it. Some of the stuff can be a bit cheesy, but by and large, it's played fairly straight, and it works alright. The music is pretty generic World War II sounding music. I'm so tired of hearing that in everything. It makes sense, but at the same time, I am just so sick of hearing it. And then there's the sound effects, which are awful. Nothing sounds beefy or concussive in this game, at all. All of the weapons sound incredibly pathetic, and it's kind of weird considering how much damage they all end up doing. So, what you end up having is weapons that just sound incredibly underpowered but perform way better than they sound. Or some weapons that sound even more pathetic, but just kind of perform at a middling state, sort of like the MP40, for example, which sounds absolutely pathetic, and it takes you a good 3 to 5 hits to bring somebody down with it, but that sound makes it just sound so much weaker than it actually is. But ultimately, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as the American journalist Robert Hawkins, who goes behind enemy lines during World War II in order to cover the Polish resistance, mostly. He eventually becomes part of the resistance, and most of the story itself is actually told through various back and forth between flashbacks and current events. And what you end up finding is that the plot really doesn't matter all that much to this game. It is really more of a thing that just kind of pops up between missions, and during the actual missions it just devolves into all about gameplay, which is not necessarily a good thing. You remember how it said that this was a truly modern World War II FPS, the first truly modern one, with open-ended levels and a richly interactive combat experience, and so on and so forth. Well, it's more like every single modern military shooter slapped into one game, including Crysis. It takes a lot of cues from Crysis, not just from the CryEngine. But some of the ideas, like sneaking around and tagging enemies with your binoculars and things like that, do of course stem from Crysis, but they're executed incredibly poorly. The stealth mechanics in this game are just downright terrible. You see, you have to be crouched in order to really get anything out of stealth, which means that you're moving even slower than you already do, and you move really slowly to begin with, unless you're sprinting, in which case you just move decent speed. And when you're crouched and moving around, they can still spot you, unless you're hiding in a bush or something like that. You see, the AI can be incredibly inconsistent. Sometimes you can shoot a guy right in the face when he's standing right next to someone else, and they don't even notice, and other times they can spot you from a mile away. But don't worry, you can do stealth kills. It takes you a good 6 seconds or so to actually go through the animation, because it takes forever, but you can do them, all the while you will be shot at and found out very, very easily. And I have no idea why these stealth kill animations had to be so long. They end up making the stealth approach just irritating rather than anything else. And so you just don't do it. And instead you're running guns blazing. And even if you don't decide to do the stealth kill animations, you only really get a suppressed pistol, and that's the well rod, which is a single shot and then you have to cock the pistol. Well, you might hit them, you might not, and even then you might still get spotted. So that brings up the question, how tough are you in a fight? Well, as you've probably been seeing throughout this video, you're basically an unstoppable juggernaut of death if you have even the slightest amount of FPS skill. What you are seeing is the game played on the hardest difficulty, and I am deliberately trying to play poorly. That is how incredibly easy this game is. Did I die occasionally? Yes, I did. But it wasn't because I was playing poorly. It was because the game was not telling me how much health I actually had. It does have a regenerating health system, but you really can't tell when you're about to die, because it does a terrible job of explaining that to you. The edges of your screen get red, and they can stay that way for upwards of a minute. And you're not entirely sure why. You're not sure if it's a glitch, you're not sure if you're actually damaged. It can just sit like that. And so, you have no idea how much health you actually have. And so, you can just charge in guns blazing, mow the entire enemy platoon down, no problem, but if somebody gets a lucky shot in, you're dead. And it looks no different than if you had just taken a single hit from a pistol round. Player feedback is incredibly important in an FPS. You have to have a means of communicating to the player exactly how much health they have. Whether it's a number, whether it's the screen gets so red that you basically can't see anything, which it never really does in this game, or you actually get sound cues or something like that. The closest I got was eventually the sound started to get muffled, but it only did that once in my entire time playing this. So the feedback is just completely inconsistent and completely useless. And how about the gunplay? Well, if you've played any other modern military FPS, you've played this game. Weapons have basically no recoil, they're pinpoint accurate, except oddly enough the sniper rifles. I have no idea why, but they do not seem pinpoint accurate. And oddly enough, this is the same studio that did Sniper Ghost Warrior. And it gives no indication that there's actually any sort of in-depth sniping mechanics. You get no sort of tutorial message or anything like that saying, hey, the sniper rifles actually behave differently. So I'm just assuming that they have a cone of fire even when you're aiming. So it's actually a pain to use a sniper rifle in this game. You may or may not hit the target. It just seems kind of arbitrary. So when you get down to it, it's really more economical to use just a bolt-action rifle like the Kar98. And even if you're using something you can aim pretty well with, damage modeling isn't all that consistent either. Sometimes you can hit them in the head and they're just fine. Sometimes you can hit them once in the leg and they instantly die. It just seems completely arbitrary. Most of the time, it only takes 1 to 3 hits to bring an enemy down. Usually 1 if you're using the Kar98, for example. But sometimes you'll hit them and it will take you 2 or 3. And you're not entirely sure why. You just keep shooting. And it's not like you're ever going to really run out of ammo. There's tons of ammo boxes sitting around that you can just walk right up to and instantly all of your ammo is refilled. You can also use grenades, Molotovs, things like that in order to eviscerate your opponents, but why bother? It doesn't really have as much of an effect as just normal bullets in this thing. The enemy sees grenades, they call them out, and then they try to move away on occasion. Sometimes it actually works, but most of the time the throwing doesn't really feel all that consistent. It's just kind of hard to really judge the physics of how they're actually using the grenades in this thing. It's just a mess. And the level structure itself really isn't all that open-ended. Basically, you have 2 approaches. You can either be sneaky or you can run in guns blazing. And usually the guns blazing method is slightly more enjoyable, but that's not saying much. Stealth is incredibly boring, and the shooting itself is just incredibly tedious. So there's really not any proper challenge to this thing. And the occasional environmental thing that will actually say, if you shoot a certain bit holding a bunch of logs in place, they'll start rolling down a hill and you can actually take out enemies that way. Those are very few and far between, and there's not really any proper sabotage elements. That you're not playing like you think a resistance fighter would be playing. Instead, you're, like I said, an unstoppable juggernaut of death. And it ends up being incredibly tedious to play this thing. And there's also a multiplayer mode, but there's one pretty big problem, and you'll see it in this clip right now. As you can see, there is literally no one playing this game. At all. It's a dead game. And there's a very good reason for that. It's awful. This goes beyond just being a very mediocre imitation of current modern military FPSs. It's a shoddily thrown together, buggy mess. Not just with the non-game breaking stuff I mentioned before talking about the presentation. Oh no. I've had this thing outright crash on me multiple times. I've had it corrupt save data, so I've had to restart entire missions. And the checkpoint system is not at all helpful. You can actually replay a good 5 to 10 minutes of a given level because the checkpoints are fairly few and far between in certain spots. And there's really no incentive to suffer through this thing. Once you get past the incredibly boring combat and even more boring stealth segments, you find that there's not really anything in this game that's actually enjoyable. It's more of a matter of you just found something that's fairly mediocre. Oh look, you got a shotgun. Well, the enemies are no smarter and no tougher, so it's not like this is really anything. But hey, it's a shotgun. And shotguns are cool, right? I guess. So ultimately, what you find with Enemy Front is basically an assembly of everything wrong with current FPSs. It does try to do some things that are slightly different, but ultimately it just feels like a pale imitation of all these different elements that it's slapping together in a game haphazardly. It even includes things from the other games that City Interactive did, like the Sniper Ghost Warrior series. It has bullet cam on the sniper rifles, and you just sit there like, why? It doesn't always trigger, and it doesn't make any sense to have it. It's not an integral part of the game. Why is it there? It made more sense for the sniper games, but I don't understand why they did it here. I guess because they thought it looked cool, but it doesn't. It's just kind of annoying, actually. And between the bugs and boring stealth mechanics that don't always work right, and the poor hit registry that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, the poor damage modeling, the poor feedback that you're getting and all that, as well as the extremely poor AI where friendlies are completely useless and will actually get in your way more often than not, and enemies are just capable of occasionally hitting you. But at least it's something, right? And no multiplayer because nobody's playing it, not because it doesn't exist, because it does exist. But even then, the max number of players is 12 players, so it's not like you're talking about big, awesome multiplayer or anything. It's just fairly generic stuff. An arsenal that we've been through before that has basically no recoil whatsoever and really doesn't feel good to use. Enemy front just ends up being a complete mess that you should avoid like the plague. When people keep saying, oh, we should have more World War II games, this is basically what you're gonna get. And you have to ask yourself, do you really want more crappy World War II games? No, you don't. I know I don't. I had more than my fill of them back in the day, when we had a sea of them. And in this day and age, we should have stuff that is just far better. And what we end up with is this. And I think it's even worse in this case than if it were just another World War II game, where you're playing through the invasion of Normandy yet again. No, in this one, you're doing something that you do not normally see in World War II games, or games in general. And yet, they screwed it up this badly. It's frankly disgusting. But you know what the really sad part is? This is more playable than a lot of the stuff that came out last year. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.